So tomorrow we get the first official look at how much money COVID-19 has wiped from the federal government's books. Bill Morneau will table a fiscal update in the House of Commons, and although they're not calling it an update, they characterize it as a snapshot. Opposition parties wanted a full update, especially since the annual budget was shelved this year due to the pandemic. But the government says right now, long-term predictions are impossible. Is that true? We're going to bring in some experts. Kevin Page is the former parliamentary budget officer and now president and CEO of the Institute for Fiscal Studies and Democracy. Mostafa Askari is chief economist at the IFSD. They join me from Ottawa. And Rebekah Young is the director of fiscal and provincial economics at Scotiabank. She's in Pictou, Nova Scotia, inside the Atlantic bubble this evening. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, Kevin Page, I'd like to start with you. You said a budget should be possible, should be tabled. The government says it can't be done right now. Given that, what do you expect to see tomorrow from Bill Morneau?
Yeah, I think they, with language used like snapshot, I think they've lowered expectations, David. I think we will see an update. A typical update would have something like here's our economic outlook, here's our fiscal outlook, here's a statement of transactions where we think the budgetary balance would be, what is happening to debt. And I think like a snapshot, certainly from the point of view of, this is where we think the fiscal situation lies today. But I think it needs to be more than that. It needs to be forward looking. If it's not a budget, it won't be a budget in terms of something that will lay down, demands for legislation. I think that will probably come later in the fall. But it needs to look at 2020 and 2021 at the very minimum.
So, Mostafa Askari, given the level of uncertainty about things like a possible second wave, you got this stunted economic growth and stunted consumer spending, even with the provinces reopening, how solid can these numbers be tomorrow? I mean, how much weight can we give them?
Well, there is always uncertainty in forecasting and forward looking. I mean, nobody knows what the future is going to look like. But the government needs planning assumptions, and those planning assumptions need to be articulated. So people, businesses, and other people that have to make decisions, they have some confidence, some planning that they can actually start acting upon those. Now, if there are things change, the government can always make adjustments. So to me, that's not a good excuse to say that because there's uncertainty, we are not going to provide any numbers. Many other organizations have done that. The PBO does that on a sort of regular basis. That doesn't mean that those numbers are precise. It means that those are the sort of planning assumptions that you need to do your job. So definitely the government needs to do that, especially in the case of the possibility of second wave. They need to provide some ideas, information, how the government is going to react to that if there is going to be a second wave.
So, Rebekah Young, given that we are expecting some big numbers coming tomorrow, we've seen projections from the parliamentary budget officer, $260 billion deficit. Is there a number that you could see tomorrow that would make you say, we're in real trouble here as a country?
No, I think that we could easily see the number coming in closer to $300 billion at the end of the day. I think on the economic picture, though, quite frankly, I think there is a consensus on the baseline. And you have to remember that private sector economists have provided these numbers, these baselines to the department. So what we're seeing is an average of what market economists like myself see in terms of the baseline. And so I think, a 260 to 300 billion would not surprise once you take in those revenue losses from the GDP shock. And we already know they've tallied almost 200 billion in discretionary spending. So I think, I edge it up a little bit beyond what the PBO has been forecasting based on a number of outstanding pressures that are still remaining and will likely remain throughout the end of the year. So I think they will want to build in a bit of a buffer based on the baseline recovery that economists are forecasting.
Rebekah, though, doesn't it seem almost certain they're going to have to keep extending some of the programs like the CERB or the wage subsidy because, the reopening is uneven. There's still an inability for people to go back. I mean, there would be a problem, too, with pulling back too soon on those programs, would there not?
Well, there's definitely an issue around elevated unemployment. So we've seen an early turn, and so that was promising in job growth, and we'll expect to see an even greater acceleration of job growth later this week. But we at Scotiabank Economics still forecast elevated unemployment rates upward of 10% by the end of the year, and still upward around 7 to 8% next year. So there will be significant unemployment across Canada for the duration of the recovery. And so the EI was not and is not sufficient to cover all Canadians that will be out of work, but the CERB clearly is too expensive for that duration. And so I think we will be looking for signs tomorrow at this isn't a Band-Aid fix, this isn't an extension of another 4 weeks that will continue in perpetuity. We would like to see some signals that they have a plan for the next 18 months in terms of addressing this persistent shock that the economy will be facing.
Kevin Page, what would you like to see there? What kind of policy or program fix? We know there's been discussion about how does the CERB move into EI and maybe transition to that sort of a program. What would you like to see from the finance minister tomorrow?
Yeah, so David, I think, like building on Rebekah's comments, Mostafa's comments, I think we're going to need something that really points to how fiscal policy will support the recovery. And so again, talk about how we will, open up the economy across the country. I think there's opportunities to bring about sort of national protocols in terms of opening up economies through contact tracing, and I think as well. I think again, some of these programs like CERB will have to evolve into programs like the wage subsidy programs, where we bring people back into the labor force. But I think how will fiscal policy be used to support the recovery in terms of additional infrastructure spending, job training programs, support for digital transformations? I think there's a need in this update to talk about building consumer and business confidence as well.
Mostafa, Askari, there is $14 billion of fiscal policy on the table from the federal government to the provinces to support things like childcare and PPE and to help with the reopening. What's at risk if that money, if they can't get an agreement and if that money isn't spent and put into the economy to help with the reopening?
Well, obviously, the provinces are in need of further funding, and if they can't get an agreement, then that would be a loss for the provinces. And I hope they can go through this, because there are provinces are in the front line. They are dealing with the healthcare issues, and from education, these are higher expenses for the provinces. So they need to get some help from the government. And hopefully, I'm hoping that they can get an agreement and go forward with this.
Rebekah Young, what's your sense of what's at stake there? If there isn't enough cash to help with things like PPE, help schools open, help childcare centres open, what's the potential risk there to the economy?
Well, first I would flag that the very substantial support that the federal government has provided, and so we're at 12% of GDP, possibly higher, has actually been favorable for provinces already, because we expect on average provinces to run deficits between 3% and 4% on average, outside of a few exceptions of either under or over. And so that is helping provinces already to that the feds are shouldering the greatest burden. But still, provinces will be facing budget shortfalls of their own in the order of $60 billion. So $14 billion doesn't go a long way, especially when it requires additional expenditures related to health and the pandemic. And so I think the $14 billion really is the opening figure. And I think that we will see incentive on both sides of the table to come up with a figure that is reasonable. But again, it's really only addressing the health costs. I think that we will see other issues, including the fiscal stabilization pressures from oil-producing regions that have had an even bigger shock and will potentially have a more protracted recovery. So I think, that's a starting point, and that's where I think we will see some contingencies possibly built into tomorrow's update to enable those negotiations to play out over the coming weeks.
Kevin Page, on contingencies, on forecasting, so much of Canada's economic growth is tied to what happens south of the border, right, in the United States. And we look at the numbers there and we can anticipate the impact that will have on the American economy. Can this country really get back on its feet if the U.S. continues on this current path?
No, it's going to be, I think We need to plan for different scenarios. Dr. Askari talked about that. People talk about V-shaped recoveries in terms of the shape of GDP, or U-shaped or L-shaped. I think like the more what we see in the United States is just the spread of the pandemic, the increase in infection, particularly in the southern U.S. I think it's going to have a negative impact on trade. We saw that in the first quarter as well, just in trade numbers. So again, this is a pandemic. It's global in nature. So the world economy is very slow. It's in recession. It's really, a historic period of time. So it's hard for the government to plan on something that looks like V-shape. And yes, we are completely tied to the U.S. economy. It will be very difficult to outperform the U.S.
I could just get a quick final thought, starting maybe with Mostafa Askari. Mostafa, what is the one big thing you'd like to hear from Bill Morneau tomorrow in this update?
I would like to see a fiscal plan, at least over the next 2 years, on how the government is going to deal with the impact of COVID-19 and help the economy to recover to its sort of normal trend.
Rebekah Young, what about you? I'm getting the sense it's simply going to be an update of numbers with no new measures, and certainly not the robust sort of updates we've seen in the past.
Yeah, I would like to see a communication and a credible communication around forward-looking plans towards calibrating fiscal policy to the actual needs of the economy and less of the political imperatives. So we do have a lot of uncertainty, but I think that some of the needs will transition away from stimulus towards these longer-term investments. So I'd like to see at least some signaling in that direction, and possibly some timeline of when we can expect more detail on that longer-term plan.
Kevin, I see you nodding along. Is that what you're hoping for tomorrow?
Yeah, I mean, both great ideas from Rebekah and from Dr. Askari. I would just add that I think a commitment to meet with the provinces, with municipalities, with First Nations group communities. I think it's just a need to bring the country together to solve this as a nation. And if we have those elements of a strategy like that, I think that would boost confidence.
Okay, thank you all so much for your time and your insight. That's Kevin Page, Mostafa Askari, and Rebekah Young. Thank you all very much. So the Liberal government is going to update Canadians on the country's current economic picture tomorrow. A fiscal snapshot is what it's being called, is coming. And what should we expect it to include? And just how big might the sticker shock of the government's pandemic aid programs be? Time now for the Power Panel. In Toronto, Tim Murphy, the managing director at Macmillan Vantage. Shakir Chambers is a senior consultant with Navigator, also in Toronto, and political commentator and former NDP MP Françoise Boivin joins us from Gatineau. Welcome to you all.
Hi, David.
Thank you.
Tim, I'd like to start with you. The government's been lowering expectations on what's going to happen tomorrow ever since they decided to call it a snapshot instead of an update. What number are you going to be looking for tomorrow?
Well, it's going to get close to $300 billion of deficit, and then I think you'll also see a lot of discussion about the uncertainty, frankly, that even that number comes with, in part because you've got to, I've been through this budget process before, and, one of the things you're doing is predicting what the GDP is going to be like. Then you're going to predict how much government revenue you're going to get, and then obviously you're predicting how much you're spending. And probably the one thing they have some line of sight in is the amount of spending they've done, and it's a big number. What they don't have quite a really good sense of is how much they're going to get in tax revenue and what the economic growth numbers are going to be. So, and those are all crucial variables in any look forward as to what's happening in the economy and therefore what's happening in the government's fiscal situation. So I expect a very big number. I think people expect a big number. I think there'll be lots of discussion about the uncertainty around it. I think there'll also be lots of discussion about how, there is no desire and no political will to move to immediately fix the large deficit problem because, frankly, the government moved to create a big supply side help, and that supply side help is still needed. So they're going to also talk about, trying to transition off the supports to an economy that's working, but only once we see the economy working.
Françoise, it sounds like we're going to get a fiscal snapshot with some updated numbers, no new measures, and a lot of caveats about the uncertainty. It's not going to be a budget, not the update that people have been asking for, like the Conservatives, like Pierre Poilievre saying we need new deficit numbers, we need new debt numbers, we need much more precise projections. So given the limitations around it, can it possibly satisfy any of the government's critics here?
If I say yes, you'll laugh in my face, David. I don't expect anybody to be satisfied tomorrow. I mean, we're talking about huge number. We're talking about, I just heard Tim with 300 billions coming out of his mouth. And I came in politics under the Martin years. Just the word deficit made us freak out. So I'm just amazed to see how we can just venture those numbers left, right, and center, and I understand it's really quite strange times lately, but I think we will at least need. I'm still hoping. I'm always the optimist that they will come up with some type of a plan for the next few years, at least with different scenario. And I don't think anybody except the opposition parties would fault them if they were wrong in certain aspects, but just to show that there's a captain inside that big ship and that they are doing those projections with different scenarios, because it's pretty scary for the next 2-3 generations.
Yeah, Shakir, on that point, is it incumbent on at this point for the government to at least put out like a pretty clear baseline, right? I mean, I think we can all understand why they couldn't do the budget on the scheduled day back in March. It would have been worthless within the hour. But they need to put out something a little bit more specific tomorrow, do they not?
I think they do, but similar to the rest of these panelists, I'm not expecting much. I actually think the government will have very similar numbers that we've seen before. I mean, the PBO has kind of conditioned us to the debt and deficit we're going to see moving forward. And I actually think that the Liberals are going to try to paint a very rosy picture. I mean, for example, we've seen reports by some of the banks that without government intervention, there'd be more bankruptcies, more unemployment, a longer and deeper recession. And I feel like the Liberals are going to try to position it that without us kind of bailing out Canadians, we'd be in a much worse situation. To some of the earlier points made on this panel, I think a lot of Canadians are probably not going to be too upset about the deficit, given that a lot of the supports have gone to them. But I think as we move forward, whether it's next year, 2 years from now, when we have to pay back these billions of dollars, I think that's when folks are going to look back and kind of shake their heads at the amount of deficit that we racked up over this 3 or 4 month period. When that bill comes due, I'm not sure there's going to be a lot of happy Canadians out there.
What other option would there have been? I mean, just Bill Morneau spoke to my colleague Aaron Weary and made the point that the government took on the debt, so Canadians didn't have to take on all of this debt. I mean, what other option would there have been other than to run up a historic deficit?
Yeah, listen, I agree that you have to be there to support Canadians. I don't think that's the question, that the government had to intervene. I think the way the government intervened with some of these programs obviously could have been rolled out better. We've seen whether it was scrutiny of the wage subsidy, whether it's scrutiny right now of the CERB and how that's being rolled out. There are ways to improve these measures that I'm not so sure the government's going to be listening to tomorrow. And to be quite honest, I've heard the Conservatives, I've heard the NDP kind of propose what the government should be doing. There's really no incentive for the Liberals to take any of these recommendations seriously, given that this is not going to a vote. So they're going to do what they want to do, and I'm pretty sure it's just going to be a very rosy picture, present themselves as heroes, and move forward to the next day.
Tim Murphy, your old boss, Paul Martin, never would have wanted to table a deficit quite like this. But it was a different time in the 90s, obviously. Is there a political cost to the government here for running up all of this debt, or is there a broader acceptance of the public, do you think, that it's a necessary evil?
Yeah, I think I think the public is quite aware that it's a necessary evil, and frankly, even before this happened, the cogency of deficit and debts as a political tool were pretty low. The public had kind of moved on. And frankly, to even get them to care about it in the first place, the government of Jean Chrétien and Paul Martin as finance minister had to spend a year, using political capital to create an interest in the issue. And frankly, you have 8 million Canadians who are recipients of a variety of measures, and it's all gone primarily to people who either have lost their job and need support, or allowing them to stay in their job and needed support, needed help in their business, needed help, and so it's gone to people, and so it was needed to have happened. Otherwise, it would have been horrific. I mean, I saw reports saying 3 to 4% of GDP was saved by virtue of the government action. And I think, frankly, going forward, the fact I think people are going to look, we want a job, we want to have enough money to live, we want to have some sense the economy's got a positive direction. And if the government takes on a big pile of debt to do that, I don't think it's a political cost. In fact, you can look back to the Second World War, where the federal government had numbers that were in excess of 100% of GDP for debt. We're going to be nowhere near that. Even with this large deficit number, we're going to be under 50%. So there's, and Canadians grew out of that. And I think you'll see the bond rating agencies and banks all saying, don't cut too fast because we need the economy to continue to grow. And the economic supports from the government are crucial to that.
So, Francoise, if we accept the argument that the spending was necessary and has generally been well received in its intention by Canadians, if not always in its execution, what's the political play here for the opposition parties tomorrow?
That's really a tough question because I don't think they have that many political play. They have maybe one that I see that is very important is maybe keep raising the different issues. I mean, like the funding, the $900 million. I know it's hard right now to sometimes have the information. I'm sure journalists are well aware of that. You don't always receive all the details. But they have to keep at it. I was hearing Tim talk about the Second World War. I agree, but we're in an era of information circulating way faster and information coming from all type of source. So the government absolutely need to be a bit more wary of what's happening because their great polling numbers could change really quickly. Give and take a few more files like the charity episode. So they have to be careful. The opposition pretty much that only as a play in my view. But the government has to have an end game. It has to, especially with the confinement happening, a business reopening and so on. It's going to be harder for them to justify the financing that they give around and different programs if business seems to be coming back as long as there's no second wave that reconfine everybody.
So Shakir, just a quick final thought. How do the Conservatives go at this? Because on fiscal policy, it's been the deficits have been reckless and the $20 billion deficits prior to all of this. How do the Conservatives play this tomorrow when it's going to be this eye-popping number of $250 billion deficit or more?
I think there's two things. If we don't see even a short-term plan of how the government gets to economic recovery or how the government plans on, for example, weaning Canadians off the CRB, there's easy lines that the Conservatives can roll out tomorrow. I would also add tomorrow, if there's no kind of real picture from the government as far as what happens next in the economy, right? What measures are they spending on? Is there an economic stimulus? I think the Conservatives can also play the card of accountability and transparency. To Francois' point, when they have pressed the government in accountability, such as the We Charity, things have come of that. There have been some misguided or some mismanaged funds throughout this. I'm pretty sure if we continue to move forward, that the Conservatives are calling for additional funding for the Auditor General to do his work. If we continue to see those kind of investigations, I'm pretty sure the Conservatives will have a lot of information to put out there to the public.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.